Biennial continuo for 2 years in a row in the reign of Cleopatra, there was no Nile flood.
To Cleopatra, it must have seemed the failed floods were the wrath of the gods. But groundbreaking new research has revealed a very different culprit. And the evidence was discovered a world away from the heat and dust of Egypt, frozen in time, deep in the 2-mile thick ice sheets of Greenland. The captive animals of Hierakonpolis were treated better than most of the ancient population. But keeping them alive was only half the battle. First, they had to be captured and brought in from the wild. This would require a fearless team of captors who traveled to the far reaches of their known world to bring back exotic creatures. So how did the prehistoric animal collectors capture these massive, dangerous animals? A clue may come from one species in the animal graveyard.
We have over 60 dogs buried in the cemetery to date. So it was very interesting. In our dog burials, we started to get these twisted bits of leather. And it became very quickly clear to us that these must be the dogs' leashes.
The discovery of the leather leashes suggests these dogs were domesticated. Clues that support the role domestic dogs played in ancient Egypt can be found over 2,000 miles away at the Cinquantenaire Museum in Belgium. This ancient pot was made in Egypt over 5,000 years ago and dates to the same time as the animal burials in Hierakonpolis. For archaeologist Stan Hendricks, the images suggest the art of hunting and capturing wild animals had become a finely tuned operation.
We have a hunting scene on this spot. So there is quite a number of the low desert animals, such as ibex, as gazelle. But the most important thing, of course, are the 2 dogs. These dogs are chasing the animals, and you should consider this as controlling the animals. Their long legs indicates that they were dogs aiming at making speed, and that makes a lot of sense, of course, because they were to chase the animals.
But this ancient hunting scene also reveals a detail that provides an exact match to the dogs discovered at Hierakonpolis.
See, the dog has an actual collar. The line goes through over the neck. But there's also this very long leash. And this has most probably to do with the way in which the animals were unleashed. And the trick is to unleash these dogs all at the same time. The right moment when the dog should take off after the animal to be chased.
The dogs were clearly essential to the prehistoric hunters. And the evidence suggests their role continued long after death.
From their placement in the cemetery, it seems that they're also there as herders of the animals. So we get a wild animal, a dog burial, wild animal, dog burial. So interspersed around the complex are dogs, especially at the 4 corners. So they act as essentially guard dogs.
Renee and her team have discovered a prehistoric cemetery unlike any other. The wild animals were sourced from across the continent. They were kept in captivity and fed by humans. For Renee, there can be only one feasible explanation for this bizarre sight.
So here, in essence, we have the world's first zoo. This dates back over 6,000 years ago. This is before even the invention of writing, before the invention of the potter's wheel. This is before pyramids were even a glint in some king's eye.
The animals from the zoo would become key players in Egypt's religious iconography. They were buried alongside the early rulers of Hierakonpolis.
We've been able to get dates on our animals now from what they had for their final meal. And this has allowed us to get carbon-14 dates, which has been showing us that many of these animals were buried all at the same time because the dates are almost identical.
Incredibly, these animals did not die of natural causes. They were all systematically slaughtered and buried around their ruler.
This ruler, like the other ones we have here, had a number of animals with him. So we have a leopard, we have baboons, we have an aurochs, we have a crocodile, and we have an ostrich.
René now suspects that when a ruler died, his captive animals were killed and buried with him. Their mystical power would accompany the ruler to the afterlife. But evidence reveals it wasn't just animals that were slaughtered for the royal burial. It was also women and children.
At a funeral, everybody went together. That both the animals and the humans were accompanying the ruler to the next life.
The bones from the graves reveal a disturbing tradition: the mass slaughter of humans and animals to mark a ruler's passing. Posts in the ground and remnants of colored wood indicate the tombs were once covered. This was a lavish funeral complex of unrivaled grandeur in prehistoric Egypt.
So you have the main tomb in the center, which you can see over there. Then you have the human burials, which will be laid out all around, and then surrounding that were all the animals, forming it like a belt of protection.
March 2017, the culmination of a 5-year dig in the working-class district of Mataria. The archaeologists are completing their investigation of a 3,000-year-old temple. A temple built by the legendary Egyptian pharaoh, Ramses the Great. Then, at the far end of the site, a shovel strikes something solid.
Suddenly, the workmen told us, there is a big stone.
As the team clears the mud, something remarkable begins to emerge.
And suddenly we realized that our workmen are standing on top of a chest.
Slowly, a giant torso is revealed, and it's made of quartzite, one of the most prized stones in ancient times. Within minutes, a giant head is discovered, buried upside down in the mud. The archaeologists realize they've just made the find of a lifetime. They've uncovered a giant statue of a pharaoh. So far, the team only has the top half of the faceless statue. But its size, the quartzite stone, and the intricate detail of the carving all suggest this was a monument of huge importance.
Probably it was a king, but which king, nobody knew.
Incredibly, when the mud was cleared, a series of hieroglyphs were exposed, cut into the super hard quartzite rock.
We found 4 hieroglyphs. The quality of the inscriptions is amazing. I mean, it looks like if you cut in a piece of butter, but you are dealing with one of the hardest materials ancient Egypt has to offer.
To the archaeologists' disbelief, the hieroglyphs revealed the identity of the pharaoh. But this wasn't the name experts were expecting.
These are the all-important hieroglyphic signs, and although this inscription is broken, the signs give us one of the names of Pharaoh. But in this case, this is not one of the names of Ramesses the Great. It's one of the names of a pharaoh we know today as Psamtik I. This is a name that's almost unknown except to Egyptologists. And to find it on the back of this statue was a huge surprise.
Until now, it was thought that Psamtik was nothing more than a small-time pharaoh. But the size of the statue suggests he was a king of far greater importance than history had led experts to believe. The accounts of Psamtik by ancient historians are few and far between. But what experts do know is that Psamtik I ruled Egypt for 54 years, from 664 BCE. At this time, Egypt was no longer the mighty superpower of old. And experts had thought Psamtik ruled when the country was on its knees.
It was not the glory days anymore. Egypt wasn't as wealthy as it had been, it didn't control the same territory, didn't have the same empire, and we have thought, up until now, that Pharaoh just didn't really have the means to build statues on this scale. And this statue changes all of that.
The archaeologists had stumbled upon an ancient masterpiece of a forgotten pharaoh. Its discovery is now revealing the secrets of a lost Egyptian history. The evidence unearthed over 3 decades of excavations at Hierakonpolis suggests the forerunners of the pharaohs went to great lengths to put together a collection of exotic and dangerous animals. The question is why? Was there more to the tradition than just a projection of the early rulers' might? Egyptologist Salima Ikram has a theory. She believes it was a weapon in a battle against a force of nature the Egyptians feared more than anything else: chaos.
The ancient Egyptians realized that nature was chaotic, and if they were going to survive, it had to be controlled.
For the ancient Egyptians, the embodiment of chaos was water. And at Hierakonpolis, chaos in its deadliest form was never far away. The River Nile might seem calm on the surface, but it wasn't always like this. The mighty Nile was the lifeblood of Hierakonpolis, providing lush, fertile land in the middle of the desert. But what the river gave, it could also take away. The summer monsoon rains over Ethiopia brought annual flooding to the Nile Valley. These were often catastrophic, leaving the inhabitants of Hierakonpolis at its mercy.
When the Nile flooded, it burst its banks, washed away entire villages and communities, killed lots of animals. So the Nile was not always very orderly. In fact, it was very chaotic.
The ancient Egyptians were terrified their civilization would be wiped out by chaos. To ensure it wasn't, they did all they could to physically take control of the unpredictable river.
So they built dikes, they built canals, they observed what happened, they parceled out the land, and so there was some degree of order being established.
But despite their best efforts, the might of the Nile was still beyond their control. It is the belief of some archaeologists that these early rulers tried to control chaos by controlling the magical powers of the beasts they'd captured.
The keystone, the foundation for Egyptian religion, is the idea of order, ma'at, over chaos, isfet. And one of the things was controlling the wild beasts that frequented the land and were of great threat to the ancient Egyptians, and the control of the river, which could be so chaotic.
Experts now suspect the zoo was a magical weapon, in an ongoing battle against chaos. The Egypt that Psamtik was born into was a war-torn country, ruled by foreign superpowers. Egypt had been conquered, and the Assyrians, led by the tyrant king Esarhaddon, now ruled the north. Centered around Nineveh in modern-day Iraq, their empire spread across the Middle East and deep into Egypt. Psamtik grew up seeing his father subjugated by the Assyrians. For the heir to this puppet kingdom, the future looked bleak.
Psamtik is nothing. He is a prince, but he has no position and no power at all.
But the Assyrians' desperate need for power was to be their downfall, and Psamtik's gain. While the Assyrians ruled the north, the south had been conquered by the Kushites. Both wanted total control of Egypt, and both eyed Thebes, now modern-day Luxor, as their capital city of choice. The Assyrian assault on Thebes was merciless. The Kushites were powerless against the savage onslaught. With Psamtik's father dead, the Assyrians picked the young prince to govern Egypt.
The Assyrians perhaps thought that he was just another local, small-time ruler that they could keep on a leash, but they were wrong.
He was really quite an innovator, and it was because he was an innovator that he was successful.
The key to Psamtik's early success were mercenaries, or hired muscle. But these weren't just any soldiers. They were elite warriors, bought in from ancient Greece.
The Greek soldiers were the prime soldiers of their day in the Eastern Mediterranean. And they would have been, therefore, the most fearsome warriors that anybody would be likely to encounter.
Psamtik had a deadly foreign army at his disposal. He put it to work, conquering the neighboring city-states. By 651 BCE, they'd achieved their objective, and Psamtik was in total control of the north. In just over a decade, the puppet ruler had become the genuine pharaoh of Lower Egypt. The coffin was sitting on a pile of rubble, containing several artifacts that more closely matched the age of the tomb.
The tomb was filled with a more or less horizontal layer of debris. It was a bit higher here, and then it turned more or less horizontal like this.
Under the rubble, there was a grim discovery: the mutilated remains of a second body. A mummy that had been completely unwrapped and dismembered. The design of KV-64 meant it was probably built for a member of the royal family.
Here you can see the egg was wrapped in separately, which is a characteristic of the New Kingdom. The fingers were bandaged separately, the arms. You can see the cut that was performed in order to take out all the inner organs and stuffed with very, very thin linen bandages in rolls.
Bickel turned to a colleague 2,000 miles away in Switzerland at the University of Zurich. Professor Frank Rulli is an expert in using state-of-the-art medical technology to unlock the secrets of ancient mummies.
Here we have the pelvic region, and you actually see part of the right forearm as well, part of the right hand. And we clearly see it's a more female-ish pelvis, wide pelvis.
All the evidence suggests this was a woman who died around the age of 40 and was a member of the Egyptian elite. But despite all her wealth and status, her body was badly mutilated after death in a surprising act of sacrilege. For Suzanne Bickel, this act of willful desecration can mean only one thing: tomb raiding.
The mummy was entirely wrapped in tens of layers of linen wrappings. And this was taken apart because the robbers were certainly expecting, and perhaps they were lucky, to find jewelry or precious amulets. Once a mummy is unwrapped, it becomes very fragile, nothing to hold the joints together. The head had fallen off. Of course, this is the most fragile part of our bodies. And once it is not held together by the wrappings, the head will just fall off.
Like almost every tomb in the Valley of the Kings, KV-64 had been the victim of grave robbery. The Egyptians believed at sunset, the sun god Ra died. In order to be reborn at sunrise, Ra had to travel through a dark, watery underworld. And that journey was far from plain sailing.
The journey is fraught with danger. The underworld was inhabited by gods, goddesses, demons, beasties.
And ancient Egyptians believed that would mean the end of everything.
There would be no light. We would be plunged into eternal darkness.
This would be Tutankhamun's royal mission, to make sure the sun would rise again by supporting Ra during his treacherous nightly journey through the underworld.
When he was alive, Tutankhamun would have been responsible for making sure that the priests of the sun god Ra worshipped every hour and helped the sun across the sky. But that responsibility didn't end when Tutankhamun died. He was then sailing through the underworld, helping the sun god to fight off all sorts of dangers which might have obstructed the sun and prevented the sun from being reborn in the morning. And this was of vital importance to the Egyptians.
If the king were not doing his job, there was always the fear that at night the evil powers would win and there would be no daylight, there would be no good, and the world would simply collapse.
This critically important mission would require a vessel of exceptional power and beauty, a boat fit for a god. And Selima believes this is it, a boat specially designed for the sun god and known as a solar boat or bark.
Tutankhamun and all kings had to have a solar bark in their tomb so they could join with the sun god to carry out this very, very vital battle.
It's an extraordinary journey that started in January 2011, when a team of Swiss archaeologists stumbled upon something unexpected in a small side canyon of the Valley of the Kings. The team had been preparing to excavate a previously discovered tomb called KV-40.
From older plans, it was known that there is a tomb, so we started working in the shaft, going deeper and deeper. While constructing this protection, our workmen realized there is something.
The workmen's discovery turned out to be a shaft.
For about 2 meters depth, we came upon a layer of big stones, very big stones, that clearly sealed and prevented anybody from going further down. And we just removed one stone and tried to hold a little camera inside. And that was the moment where we knew we could now see inside.
But as the team broke through the seal, the tomb they discovered was nothing like King Tut's. There was a single, simply decorated coffin. And as the team moved further inside the chamber, the mystery only deepened.
The room is very small, some 4 meters in length, some 2 meters in height. It's one of the smallest type of tomb we find in the Kings Valley.
KV-64 consisted of a simple vertical entrance and a single chamber, a style known as a shaft tomb. It was too modest to be the tomb of a pharaoh, but its location in the Valley of the Kings meant it still had royal credentials.
What is characteristic about these undecorated tombs, you can see it here, these walls were left absolutely plain. And that has nothing to do with the tombs being unfinished. And it's in a way astonishing because the pharaoh have beautiful tombs. So it's probably to do with tradition. Princes, royal daughters, royal wives' tombs were never decorated.
The design of KV-64 meant it was probably built for a member of the royal family.
So the Valley of the Kings is an extraordinary place because it's the home of the tombs of the rulers of the great imperial age of ancient Egypt.
Since the late 1700s, archaeologists have been scouring every inch of the valley in a quest for knowledge and treasure. Over the years, they've uncovered the underground tombs of at least 20 pharaohs, as well as crypts for dozens of royal wives, children, and leading courtiers. Why did the pharaohs of the New Kingdom choose to bury their dead deep underground and not in pyramids like the earlier kings of Egypt?
Presumably, pharaohs were buried with a lot of material from the beginning of time. And traditionally, they had been buried in these massive, great structures, these pyramids, that were, of course, very obvious.
The pyramid in particular was a real marker of what was underneath. So if your burial chamber had a pyramid on top, it's saying to robbers, here be jewels.
The Valley of the Kings was meant to be the New Kingdom's solution to tomb robbing.
So the classic New Kingdom tombs in the Valley of the Kings consist of a series of passageways and descending corridors leading to the burial chamber.
That was supposed to be a secret, hidden and protected place where he could rest for eternity together with all of his stuff.
But just like the pyramids before, it didn't work. Over the millennia, the promise of riches had led to all but Tut's tomb being ransacked. The largest pieces of the colossal statue of forgotten Pharaoh Psamtik I are today on display at the Cairo Museum. But 1,900 other fragments recovered from the site are being pieced together at the state-of-the-art Grand Egyptian Museum.
This is the next step in Egyptian archaeology. It's where all the priceless artifacts from the tomb of Tutankhamun are being analysed before they go on display in the new Grand Egyptian Museum, and it's where thousands and thousands of Egypt's most valuable treasures are being investigated.
From the 1,900 recovered fragments, little remained of Psamtik's shattered legs. The challenge for the experts was to work out if the pharaoh was depicted sitting or standing. The pose would help determine the true scale of the Colossus. And their answer came from an unexpected piece of the puzzle.
These lines can really only be the folds from a kilt, a short kilt that Pharaoh was wearing. So this is a part of the middle of his body. And in fact, these curves represent the top of his left leg and his rear end. So it's this kind of part here. And this is really, really interesting because the curves are moving down the kilt, down the pharaoh's leg, and they are angled forwards from his body.
Detailed analysis of the folds revealed they could only form like this if Psamtik was standing up. Incredibly, the intricate detailing allows experts to now recreate his exact pose.
So his left leg wouldn't have been entirely upright, in line with the upper part of his body. It would, in fact, have been standing sort of forward. So he would have been more in a kind of a striding pose, like this. Would have conveyed a sense of sort of strength and power. It's a very imposing sort of shape he casts in this pose. And this is absolutely classic of Egyptian royal sculpture.
The fragments reveal the complete statue would have been 36 feet tall, an all-powerful striding colossus. It's a striking power pose, and it's uncannily similar to a statue on display at the Cairo Museum.
This is a statue of Pharaoh Senusret III, and look, it's got the same well-defined torso, the same clear pectoral muscles, muscular shoulders. It's got the same divine beard. It's got the same white crown. And also, crucially, if you look here, his left leg is extended forward, giving him this striding pose, exactly as we see in the other statue. And so in all the crucial details, this statue is exactly the same as that of Psamtik.
But despite its near identical appearance, there's one crucial difference. This statue was created at a time when the Egyptian Empire was in its ascendancy, not in decline. 1,200 years before Psamtik was born.
So it appears that Psamtik was following in a tradition which was well over 1,000 years old by his time. And in fact, the tradition of having statues carved like this goes back even further to the time of the pyramids, well over 2,000 years before Psamtik's time.
In 44 BC, ancient Egypt began to fall apart. On the world stage, Cleopatra's Roman ally and protector, Julius Caesar, lay dead. Within a year of Caesar's death, Egypt was gripped by drought, famine, and disease. A clue to the actual cause can be found in a book written around 100 years after Cleopatra's death by the Roman philosopher and historian Seneca.
So this is the book of Seneca's Natural Questions, and we're looking at here a really important passage where Seneca tells us, biennio continuo, for 2 years in a row in the reign of Cleopatra, there was no Nile flood.
To Cleopatra, it must have seemed the failed floods were the wrath of the gods. But groundbreaking new research has revealed a very different culprit. And the evidence was discovered a world away from the heat and dust of Egypt, frozen in time, deep in the 2-mile-thick ice sheets of Greenland. Environmental historian Francis Ludlow has traveled to a specialist sub-zero facility in Copenhagen, Denmark, where the samples of ice, known as ice cores, are stored. Each year, as a new layer of ice freezes, gases and particles present in the water and air are trapped. So, by analyzing the chemical composition of individual layers going back tens of thousands of years, scientists can build up a picture of the environmental conditions at any given time. Francis believes that a particular group of chemicals trapped in the ice during Cleopatra's time played a critical role in her story. They're called sulfates, and they're formed from sulfur dioxide. Today, sulfur dioxide is produced by burning fossil fuels. But 2,000 years ago, there was only one possible source: a volcanic eruption. Using these sulfate spikes, scientists have pinpointed the date of every major volcanic eruption back to around 500 BC. And there's one spike that towers over all the others. Because this eruption happened in the same year as Caesar's murder, when strange visions filled the skies, and Egypt descended into famine. 44 BC. It could be an extraordinary coincidence, but historians Francis Ludlow and Joe Manning think it's more than that. They believe this cataclysmic eruption played a critical role in pushing Cleopatra and her country towards destruction. In 44 BC, the world experienced a devastating volcanic eruption. Its effects were global, and it hit ancient Egypt hard, causing catastrophic failures of the life-giving Nile flood and years of famine, pushing Cleopatra and her country towards self-destruction and political ruin.
Rome is in civil war, which is both very difficult for Cleopatra, but in a way puts her in quite an interesting position of power.
Rival factions turned to Cleopatra for financial and logistical aid. In richer times, it's possible the queen could have backed both sides and hedged her bets. But with her country crippled by famine, Cleopatra was forced to make a decision that could cost her everything. According to the Alexandrian historian Appian, she tried to buy herself some time before making her fateful choice.
Cleopatra, we're told by Appian, uses as an excuse the fact that Egypt is experiencing famine and plague, and so is not able to help.
For centuries, historians like Appian have interpreted the reference to plague as a cunning excuse, a ploy that would allow Cleopatra to identify the stronger side before declaring her allegiance. But experts now believe that Cleopatra's excuse for failing to come to the fight may well have been true. And the famine and disease she was describing were the after effects of the volcanic eruption in 44 BC. As thousands of starving refugees swarmed into the city in search of food.
Mass migration of people and the whole movement of populations from place to place encourages the risk of infectious diseases being transmitted. People are coming together, they're sharing food, they're sharing liquids, and they're sharing an environment which encourages the spreading of diseases.
Dr. Houtan Ashrafian, Chief Scientific Advisor at Imperial College in London, has been investigating the late Egyptian Empire for years. He believes a medical text reveals the Nile flood failures had a direct and deadly effect on the health of Cleopatra's people.
There are sanitation diseases and infectious diseases, and these include things like typhoid, cholera. But actually, the symptoms that were described by Dioscorides Phacas were those of fever, malaise, boils, and delirium. And all of these, when you add them together, fit very closely to bubonic plague.
By 41 BC, 3 years after the fateful eruption brought drought and disease to Egypt, Cleopatra couldn't stall any longer. She had to choose a side in the Roman Civil War. And that choice would prove fatal.